If the Great Brits and America list the 250 top Russians who are about to be expelled and said we've gone three, now we're going to do another three every day until you stop, doesn't that generate some more specific pressure than the generalized swift banking and banking? Those are dissipated as they move down the food chain and up towards Putin. But if you go after the oligarchs, those are sharp blades at people close to him.
Yeah, they are, and we have already put many of these sanctions in place. But with these sanctions, they have to be maintained, right? Because if you sanction individuals and their companies, they spin off a little shell company and they adapt to it over time. So I think the renewed effort on this is good, and I think also the multinational effort. And I think if the Biden administration has done anything well, I think it is to get as much as they can out of our European friends and partners so that there's a unified response. And one of the things Putin wants more than anything is disunity. And there's been a fair bit of that, with President Macron going there, maybe making some promises and, on the part of the Ukrainians, which he has no power to do. Germany's response was tepid, especially because of their dependence on Russian oil. But overall, it's been pretty good in terms of the unified results. So I think that we're in good shape in terms of the unity of effort. And I think we're going to continue to see, an emphasis on making sure we can all work together.
Now, General, in Battleground, you trace the 2014 invasion that Putin orchestrated through his little green men to the decision by President Obama to do nothing after the red line was crossed. How much do you consider Putin's actions this week to be connected to our collapse in Afghanistan last year?
Absolutely connected. Absolutely connected, Hugh. And you're right. In Battlegrounds, I draw this line. I really see it clearly, between the unenforced red line in Syria, 2013, 2014, after Assad commits mass murder of hundreds of people, including hundreds of children, and the inviting of Russia into Syria, right, to enable the serial episodes of mass homicide, which are the Syrian civil war. That allowed Putin to not only extend his influence in the Middle East, not only to enable Iran there as well, but also to create a migrant crisis, which he's using to weaken European resolve. So what he does, he creates this migrant crisis. Then what he does is he supports a lot of the nativist parties and tries to polarize European societies like he does with us too, pit communities against each other and weaken their resolve. Putin plays a great game. He plays a strong man, but he doesn't have a lot of resources, Hugh. His economy is the size of Italy's economy. And so what his theory of victory is, he can drag everybody else down and he'll be the last man standing. I think he saw weakness, obviously, in our surrender to a terrorist organization. I don't know what else you call it, in Afghanistan, and retreat there. And what he's doing is he's acting on that perception of weakness with renewed aggression, renewed offensive against Ukraine. I think Xi Jinping is also emboldened because of this. And we're likely to see, I think, Xi Jinping become even more aggressive in the South China Sea and against Taiwan as well.
Now, General, will you speak to the problem we have in the American media? Whenever you say something like he's played his hand well, or what President Trump did very inartfully yesterday, the media in America is more interested in attacking Republicans and trying to make it look like a recognition of Putin's evil genius is an applause of Putin's evil genius. Now, Fiona Hill wrote, Mr. Putin, you quote her on page 29, Putin thinks, plans, and acts strategically. And that's not any different. We're not praising him. But why is the American media fixated on the fact that the recognition of his malign abilities it's not the same as saying, way to go, Putin. It's not even close. He's a miserable, horrible character, but the American media jumps on this stuff.
Yeah, I don't know why. This is something that we ought to all come together behind, right? I mean, this is
Yes.
This is clear. We have to remember 14,000 people already died in Ukraine, and the people in the eastern part have suffered tremendously. Ukraine is actually being punished a lot more than Russia's being punished right now because of the effect on trade and investment. And this is what I would like to see more of, Hugh, is more support, right? As we recognize the effectiveness of Russia's aggression. We also should recognize, hey, when he meets stiff resistance, he stops, right, and pulls back. I think an example of this is in Syria in February of 2018. A lot of people forget this. Russian mercenaries on tell the story in Battlegrounds. They attacked our special forces and the Syrian democratic forces in Syria. Why? They did it because they were sitting on the Conoco oil facility. And you know what Russia needs? Russia needs that oil to help reconstruct the country they helped to destroy in Syria. And so they attacked with this Wagner group. We killed over 200 Russians. What did the Russians do? They didn't say anything. They did everything they could to hide the casualties. So I think while Putin is posturing, I think that the fact that the Ukrainians are much better at defending themselves now, and the support that we've given them, hopefully will be enough to deter a continued offensive against the Ukrainians. But I'll tell you, Hugh, as I look at what they're doing. We've seen the reports of field hospitals and blood banks and everything. I think he's getting ready to renew the offensive and to go even more deeply into Ukraine.
General, shock and awe may be coming. The Prime Minister of Australia warned last night within the next 24 hours. Shock and awe did not reduce Saddam's militants to hiding. They just regrouped and came back. Will shock and awe, in your opinion, work against the Ukrainian defense forces and shatter their ability to resist and lead to the quick capitulation of the country?
It could lead to tactical gains. So what we're talking about really is what we in the military joint operations, right? This is air, land, sea operations aimed to strike targets in depth and then to follow rapidly with the ground offensive operations. That's what we want to achieve: is speed of action. And what you will try to gain here is more than physical destruction. What you want in war is you want a psychological advantage, right? That allows you to achieve a lopsided outcome in battle. But Hugh, war is, we have to still remember this, war's politics, right? It's like the Geico commercial. Everybody says that, right? Everybody knows that, right? That's what Clausewitz said. But what that means is you have to be able to consolidate gains to get to a sustainable political outcome. And the Ukrainians, I'll tell you, are not willing to accept a puppet government. They're not willing to give up their sovereignty. And I'll tell you, Putin has done more to strengthen Ukrainian nationalism than anybody ever has in the past. And Ukrainians, as you can see from the reporting there, are really rallying behind Zelensky. This narrative of that the Putin's going after Russian speakers. Hey, Zelensky's a Russian speaker. The president's a Russian speaker. So I think Ukrainians are rallying. They're doing the best they can. They deserve our support. I think I'll tell you, Hugh, I think our military support in terms of accelerating defensive capabilities to the Ukrainians was pretty weak in the beginning. It actually took the Brits to do it first. But now we're doing it, and others are as well, the Baltic states. And I think this is a little bit like 1973. When Israel was under duress, from the Arab coalition. And we flew in a tremendous amount of support that helped the Israelis defend themselves, successfully.
Yeah, Nixon said, send everything that can fly. And I hope we're doing the same thing. Before the break, I do want to ask you if you detail that the Internet Research Agency, which is Russia's bot farm, it's Internet warrior arm, they had at least 109 Twitter accounts masquerading as news organizations. Do you see the same thing right now, General McMaster? Are they up to the same level of malevolence online?
Yes, they are. It's really peaked. You can see the efforts at disinformation and propaganda. Really, they're maxing it out, right? So they're on social media, right? They're on TikTok now. One example, Hugh, that I saw just a couple of days ago were these rockets impacting in high-rise apartments, right, in the eastern provinces of Ukraine, the ones that are illegally occupied, by Russian proxies. Hey, well, that was Russian attacks in 2014, but they're recycling it, trying to show it like it's now to reinforce this false Putin narrative of genocide, in the eastern provinces. So I think we're going to see more and more of this.
I'm coming right back with General McMaster. His book, Battlegrounds, could not be more timely. We're going to talk about China, Iran, North Korea, and more. But as to the Russian new generation warfare, you've got to read Battlegrounds. Stay tuned. Welcome back, America. I'm Hugh Hewitt, joined by Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster. His new book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World, could not be more timely. I also read, to prepare for this dereliction of duty, General McMaster's first and epic history of the Vietnam conflict under Presidents Johnson and Defense Secretary McNamara. I'll come to that after the break, but I want to go, General, if I could. I want to jump over China. I'm going to come back to China. In Battlegrounds, you do Russia, China, and then you get to Iran. But I want to jump to Iran right now Because it looks like, and Senator Cotton is afraid, that we are going to find ourselves with a new JCPOA in the middle of Putin's invasion of Russia in an attempt by the Biden administration to keep down the price of oil. What would you make of the strategic implications of a new JCPOA as described in the press right now?
Hugh, Tom Cotton's right about this. What we're doing right now is we are supplicating to the Iranians. And you mentioned, the perception of weakness associated with the surrender and withdrawal from Afghanistan. That's magnified by what we're doing with the Iranians. So the Iranians have been stepping up their proxy war in Iran and in Iraq. They try to kill the prime minister of Iraq, with drones. They're intensifying their proxy war in Syria to assist Assad in, again, these serial episodes of mass homicide. But what they're really trying to do, Hugh, is put a proxy army on the border of Israel. And ultimately, they aim to destroy Israel. They say it. We have to listen to them. Houthi rebels in Yemen are firing rockets at the United Arab Emirates and into Saudi Arabia. And while they're doing that, we're over in this negotiation situation with them where we don't even get the privilege of talking to them directly. We have the Europeans supplicating for us to the Iranians, and they're demanding more and more concessions. We're giving more and more concessions. The deputy negotiator, Hugh, just resigned. He couldn't stomach it anymore. And this is a Biden administration appointee. And what we're going to get is another weak agreement. And what's significant about it, we were asking about is the strategic implications is it's going to allow them to continue their missile and their nuclear programs because the verification regime will be too weak to ensure that they're not. It's just to give them cover for that. I mean, do you really believe the supreme leader of Iran? Do you really believe the Islamic Revolutionary Guards Corps? And then the other problem is the sanctions relief, Hugh, is going to give them an influx of resources that they're going to use to intensify their proxy war further and to extend this theocratic dictatorship's grip on power. Because the beneficial owners of the companies that are going to get these profits from relaxed sanctions are the bunyads, which are these conglomerates that really are the kids oftentimes of the most senior officials. So it's going to be a disaster. It's a political disaster. It's going to be a political disaster masquerading as a diplomatic triumph, just like the first JCPOA was.
Well, that will be exposed, I think, quickly. But the overriding concept of battlegrounds is strategic narcissism. And I believe negotiating with the Iranians right now is peak strategic narcissism. And we've got, Wendy, what else do you want from the United States? Sherman over there negotiating, as she did in '94 with North Korea, as she did with the first JCPOA, as she's doing now with Iran. Strategic narcissism is the projection, if I'm correct, General, correct me, obviously you used the term, the projection onto our enemies of our values and means and ends. And they're just not the same.
They're not the same. And the point that I make in Battlegrounds is, hey, we have to pay more attention to the ideology, the aspirations, and the emotions that drive and constrain the other. Because if we don't, as you're mentioning, right, strategic narcissism is what makes us vulnerable to a whole range of cognitive traps. You're talking about mirror imaging, but also optimism bias, right? And
yes,
and confirmation bias. I mean, hey, the Iranian regime is still driven by the ideology of the revolution, and what they are determined to do is to fight against the great Satan, us, the little Satan, which they call the UK, but they call Israel the cancerous boil, who they want to wipe off the face of the earth. Now, should a regime like that have the most destructive weapons on earth? No, but the JCPOA is not going to prevent them from getting it. It's not. And so I think, Hugh, what we're going to see, if I make a prediction here, is that this will be, if there is an agreement, it'll be an extremely weak agreement. As a result,
now, General, I'm tethering the ideology of a regime from the regime is a strategic mistake. I just want to know if Iran has a Shiite end times ideology. China is Leninist. North Korea is the extreme cult of devotion to the leader. Does Russia have an ideology, or is it just Putin?
Yeah, I would say it's a nationalist ideology that is grounded in the sense of honor lost at the end of the Soviet Union, and then the failures of the reforms in the 1990s. Now, what Russian leaders want to do is they want to blame us for that. They want to blame us for the criminals who stripped out their economy as they transition to this really kleptocracy out of the communist system. And so the ideology is a sense of being dishonored and victimized by an avaricious kind of West, right? And Putin has stoked that as best as he can. And what he's trying to do, it's not to the extent that you see in China with the Great Firewall, but he wants to dominate all platforms of communication and information. You've seen how your fellow journalists have been persecuted and murdered in Russia, and how the state television has become the platform for this disinformation. It's really interesting, in the provinces that surround Ukraine.
Hold that thought, General. We're going to come back after the break and continue. Don't go anywhere, America. We're going to get to China after the break. The interview continues now with General H.R. McMaster's brand new book, Battlegrounds. The Right to Defend the Free World is in my hands, as is Dereliction of Duty, his first book, which is as necessary as ever. General, we went to break. You were talking about the ideology that Putin is deploying in the so-called independent regions, which aren't independent. They're simply occupied now.
Absolutely. And I use this as an epigraph in Battlegrounds. It's the great Orwell quote, right? That he who controls the past controls the future, and he who controls the present controls the past. And what you see with Russia is the stoking of Russian nationalism that really evokes the Tsarist period, more than the Soviet period. And this kind of rambling speech that he gave about Ukraine on Monday night is augmenting this 6,000-word essay that he published at the end of last year, which is the manipulation of history, and comes up with this myth that Lenin created Ukraine. It didn't really exist. It was part of Greater Russia until Lenin created it. And so then he goes and then he talks next about how the Ukrainians have engaged in decommunization, right, of Ukraine. So he's saying, okay, if you want decommunization, I'm going to give it to you, because really what he's threatening is the elimination of Ukraine as a state. So both Xi Jinping in China and Putin in Russia are masters at manipulating history, and this is what we're seeing him doing. So the ideology is kind of a jingoistic nationalist ideology, Hugh, but it's based on historical myth and fiction.
Well, it reminds me of Hitler running up to Munich and the stab in the back theory that always motivated the Nazis. It was a distortion of history. It was an obliteration of the Kaiser's role. It was a complete rewrite to justify whatever he wanted to do. And we're watching that now. But let's jump to China, because Battlegrounds, you begin with Russia, then you go to China for the longest segment, then you go to Afghanistan, Iran, North Korea, and some other challenges. But it is Xi, and I don't want to, originally, if we'd done this interview 3 weeks ago and Russia was still building up and fainting, we talked exclusively about Xi. So now let's go to Xi. What is Xi thinking right now as he watches this unfold, General, in your opinion?
Well, he's thinking he has a tremendous opportunity. Xi Jinping, I think, is increasingly under pressure, and he's thinking that he has a narrow window of opportunity to act while the United States appears weak and preoccupied. Why does he feel the pressure? Well, he's got a lot of economic problems, Hugh. They created tremendous frailties in their economy in the effort to surpass the United States and to export their authoritarian mercantilist model. And those are coming home. I mean, it was slower economic growth. And remember, one of the mechanisms that he's using to maintain control is the promise, right, of improved living standards within China. He also, I think, besides the frailties that we've seen, like in the real estate market, is really worried about losing control. And you see the party extending and tightening its exclusive grip on power, trying to use the cover of COVID and the Olympics to perfect its technologically enabled Orwellian police state. You see him accelerating the campaign of genocide in Xinjiang, extinguishing human freedom in Hong Kong. These are not the actions of somebody who's secure in their ability. More and more purges in the party, going after certain sectors of the economy, right? You saw him, what he did to the tech sector, and Jack Ma. I think he saw what Jack Dorsey, and Mark Zuckerberg did to Donald Trump and said, hey, Jack Ma's not going to do that to me, and he did the same thing with the education sector, the healthcare sectors in his sights, the tech sector broadly, as I mentioned. So he's not secure, but he also senses U.S. weakness. And, Hugh, a story that wasn't really covered very, very much is he's repainting many of his naval vessels in Coast Guard colors. And I think the next move's in the South China Sea. And he's going to start patrolling those islands that he built there. and say, hey, listen, I own this part of the ocean, a part of the ocean through which 1/3 of the world's surface trade flows. So I think we're in for a series of aggressive actions by Xi Jinping now that the Olympics are over. And then the next, I think, big kind of point to watch is the Communist Party Congress this November. And I think after that is the point of maximum danger for Taiwan.
Now, General, do you think, as I do, that the Olympics were a strategic loss for China in that the ratings in the West were so awful and the taint of being associated with that game so profound? It's a stink that won't get off the brand of the corporate sponsors for a long time. They were not watched. We understand China. Do you think it went like Xi planned, or did it go the way we needed it to go, which was a repudiation of that regime and its tactics?
No, I think it was a repudiation, and I think it was a blow to Xi Jinping. Now he and the people around him won't admit it. I mean, one of the dangers for autocracies and totalitarian regimes is you surround yourself with people who tell you what you want to hear. So I'm sure everybody around Xi Jinping is telling him how great he is, and how wonderful his policies are, even as he's really magnifying kind of the frailties in China's economy. But I would like to see companies, who supplicate to the Chinese Communist Party really, be an object of what we call like ESG attention, right? Environmental, social, and governance. I mean, how is genocide not an ESG issue, right? This should be an issue in every boardroom. And I think, companies that have had a tepid response, like the NBA, like other companies who have apologized for saying, oh, we're not going to use slave labor, and then the party attacks those companies, and then they walk back even that obvious comment. Who's going to knowingly use slave labor? So I think that the time is right now for companies, I think, to kind of take a Hippocratic oath, right? Don't help the Chinese Communist Party perfect their police state. Don't help them gain a differential advantage over us militarily. I mean, a lot of our pension funds, Hugh, a lot of the dumb money and index funds, financial flows associated with that's the scaffolding that holds up the Chinese economic model. And a lot of those funds are actually helping Chinese companies develop weapons to kill our grandchildren. And then finally, don't compromise the long-term viability of your company for short-term gains. So we've seen this
control or kill, right? Control or kill. They might kill our grandchildren, but they definitely want to control them. Congressman Gallagher was on with me earlier today, General, and he told me not to talk to you about sports, that you're an Eagles and Phillies fan and don't know much about sports. But I want to ask you about the NBA, because you're probably a 76ers fan if you're a Phillies and Eagles fan. Do you think Enes Kanter Freedom is not playing because he's aged out, or because he's bad for China business?
Because he's bad for China business, and it's terrible. And I'm a sports fan. I'm from Philadelphia. I think the Sixers should pick him up. They've already got Daryl Morey there, who created the initial controversy. Yes. So
when he was at Houston,
bring Enes Kanter Freedom there. He's got a strong voice. I love that guy. I'm telling you. I mean, if you haven't seen his long format interviews, I mean, people should watch it, because you know what? He's unabashedly proud to be an American, as so many immigrants are, Hugh. And these days where we see so many people subjected to the curriculum of self-loathing in our universities, to have a recent immigrant with that strong of a voice, I think is powerful and much needed, I think, to restore our confidence in who we are as a people, and our confidence and pride in our democratic principles and institutions and processes.
General, what I appreciate about Battlegrounds is you're not settling any scores with anyone. You're simply writing out of your experience as a lieutenant general in the Army, 34 years of service, your PhD from the University of North Carolina, your first book, Dereliction of Duty. So I want to make sure people understand the 4 resolutions you brought with you. I wrote about them in the Washington Post a few weeks ago to the NSC. At that time, your partner was Mike Pompeo over at CIA and Rex Tillerson at State. But you brought a certain resolve to the NSC, which has endured. I know Robert O'Brien picked up on this, about improving U.S. strategic competence. And it begins in the lessons that you learned in Dereliction of Duty. Do you see the NSC right now operating strategically, or are they caught up in a series of ad hoc improvisations, the events of which began with the collapse of the Afghanistan effort?
Yeah, Hugh, I don't know, because I'm not in there. I'm not in there now. But I'll tell you, I really think that the process, the NSC did not serve President Biden well. But as I write about in Dereliction of Duty, Lyndon Johnson got the military advice he wanted. I don't think President Biden was listening to anybody anyway. He already made up his mind. But what I write about in Battlegrounds, what I learned from dereliction of duty, and it was a great gift for me, Hugh, to me, that the Army gave me to be able to study history full time and teach at West Point. And the dereliction of duty was my dissertation at the University of North Carolina, where I had just great professors and a great environment. I mean, I really am a big believer in applied history. So I thought, okay, now I'm in the job that McGeorge Bundy was in. What am I going to do differently? And I was determined to give the president best analysis and best advice, to not tell the president what he wanted to hear. That would have been a disservice to President Trump or to any president. Now, of course, that gets you chewed up a little bit in the process, but I was at peace with that, right? I had already decided that I was going to retire at the end of that, at the end of my tenure as National Security Advisor. But the second thing that I think was really important, a lesson, one of the 4 lessons I highlight in Battlegrounds is, hey, I was going to give the president multiple options, but because I recognize he's the guy that got elected. Nobody elected me. Nobody elected even the secretaries of defense or state or anybody else in the cabinet, right? And so we owed him multiple options. And what that does is when you present multiple options, like we did on Afghanistan, you can highlight the cost and consequences of each of them. And if you remember, going back to August 2017, President Trump took a much different decision on Afghanistan that he was predisposed toward, and he should get credit for that. But sadly he backed off on it, But I think if you go back to the August 2017 speech, that was the first time in that long war that we had a reasoned, sustainable approach in place for that war. And sadly, I think we talked ourselves into self-defeat, is what I described in Battlegrounds.
Oh, my goodness. Your chapter title, A 1-Year War 20 Times Over, resonates with me because I have talked to pretty much whether it was General Petraeus or McChrystal, whether it was General Mattis, I've talked to everyone who's been running Afghanistan for 20 years. And it really was a 1-year war 20 times over. And we were constantly announcing, as you point out, our withdrawal timetable, which is what? An invitation for the other side to hang on.
Yeah, how does that work, Hugh? How does that work? I mean, if the great captains of history would come back and look at how we ran that war, they would think we're crazy, we're stupid, or both. How does it work to give your enemy the timeline for your withdrawal and say, oh, I'd like to negotiate a favorable settlement? We stopped going after the enemy aggressively. During the Obama years, we even took the Taliban off as a designated enemy. And they're killing our soldiers. They're killing Afghan civilians. And then as we were engaged in these negotiations with these jackasses in Doha, I mean, they're attacking maternity hospitals. I mean, they're gunning down infants and expectant mothers. They're bombing girls' schools. And we did nothing but double down on our determination to withdraw at all cost. And so I think this is I called us in another place the stain of 2021. It's going to be a long time before that stain of 2021 is effaced.
Well, let me talk to you a little bit about that. What Reagan did was to take the first suitable opportunity to demonstrate American strength, which was Grenada against the Cuban Soviet proxies. Do you expect that the rebuild of American credibility will have to begin, as Reagan did, patiently with a firmness at the domestic policy level, matched with a refusal to be pushed around somewhere wherever Americans are in danger?
Well, I hope whatever happens next, and there are a lot of, I think, potentials for, I would call it cascading crises this year, Hugh, that it's not at an exorbitant cost. And I just think of other times when we have seemed to have lost our resolve and how aggressors have acted. And then, of course, you have to deal with a much bigger problem, at a much higher cost. And of course, June of 1950 in Korea is a great example, right?
Yes.
We wanted to end what we thought was, an excessive commitment to South Korea. That was kind of an early end the endless war, or at least occupation of forces there, or positioning of forces in South Korea. And just a couple months after the last soldier left, North Korea invades, and then we have a war that takes over 40,000 American lives and is devastating, for the South Koreans. So I do think we have to make sure we don't undervalue our deterrence, and that's capability times will, Hugh. And I think many of our adversaries think our will is about zero.
Interesting, General, stop it. Capability times will. I like that because allegedly, everyone I've ever talked to tells me I don't have any classifications. I don't have any security clearance. I haven't since 1988. Everybody tells me we have massive cyber capabilities, that we can strike back at Russia and at China and at North Korea, and we have done so against North Korea. Do you think we have demonstrated them sufficiently to prove to our adversaries that we do indeed have the will to screw with them far beyond anything they can do to us?
Well, as you mentioned, we do have the capability. Now, of course, any action you take like that in cyberspace, can escalate. So it's really important to do. This is one of the lessons from dereliction of duty. Is Lyndon Johnson only considered each step up the next, each rung on the ladder, right? Didn't think about the whole ladder he was moving up. And of course, what's paradoxical about it is Lyndon Johnson didn't want to go to war in Vietnam, but in retrospect, every action he took looks like he was inexorably transitioning the war in Vietnam to an American war. So I think it's important to think long term, to recognize that progress in war, or even diplomacy for that matter, is never linear because of its interactive nature. And so
that's your fourth big lesson, right? No linear progress. Don't sell that idea because it doesn't exist.
Right. It doesn't exist, right? I mean, the enemy has a say, and this is the ultimate in strategic narcissism, and this is what's happened in Afghanistan, is this idea that if we disengage, it's an unmitigated good. What's striking, Hugh, and what's depressing for an historian is I don't think we can learn from even our most proximate, experiences. I mean, what President Biden did in December 2011. Remember, he called President Obama from Baghdad, and he said, "Thank you for allowing me to end this GD war." Right? Okay. Now, when he said that, of course, all of us, who had served in uniform and studied war, we said, "Well, hey, wars don't end when one party disengages." And the war was about to end a new and more dangerous phase, right? And what you saw is the return of Al Qaeda in Iraq, which became ISIS, a terrorist group that took control of territory the size of Britain, conducted about 195 attacks outside of that territory, and then compelled us to go back to enable, through the Iraqis and through Syrian forces, a long war, a war that went from 2011, 12 all the way through 2018, 19, really. And it's still going on, right? With the recent raid you saw against the leader of ISIS in Syria.
Now, you just mentioned the Johnson fallacy, the graduated pressure strategy, which is described in Dereliction of Duty. And I want to go to Dereliction of Duty. But do you think our sanctions approach to Russia is just a new version of graduated pressure, what Johnson and McNamara sold the American public in the early 60s?
Hey, it looks a little bit like it, doesn't it? Because you had President Biden say, "Well, it was just kind of a little invasion at first," right? But then he walked that back, and then and now what you're hearing is, well, if they do something else, there'll be more consequences. I think what's important with Putin, and this is what I wrote about in Battleground, is you have to impose costs on him that are beyond those that he factors in at the outset of his decision making. And as I mentioned, he's done everything he could to try to insulate Russia from sanctions over recent years. He's built up reserves and so forth. But I think if you really want to impose costs, you block his access to SWIFT. And of course, that has second and third order effects on the global economy. But you could sanction Russia's central bank. That's another kind of a step well above going just up one step of the rung each time he does something else to Ukraine. And of course, we have to recognize.
I want to close by. Go ahead.
No, I was going to say he's already accomplished quite a bit. He's already occupied Belarus, which we're not even talking about here, right? So he's already done that, and it's important to see what he's doing in Ukraine with what he's doing broadly, because he's not going to stop there. He's weaponized migrants on the Polish border. He's encouraging Serbian separatism in the Baltics to kind of reinflame the Baltic states. He's threatening in the Balkan states, and he's threatening the Baltic states directly. So I think that Putin's not going to be satisfied with anything in Ukraine, and it's important for us to really, I think, step up whatever we can do from a sanctions perspective, and not take this graduated pressure response.
No, we got to go to where we would go in the worst case scenario quickly. Now, your former colleague, Secretary Pompeo, you worked with him when he was at CIA, is going to Taiwan. And I think everyone who wants to run for president should go to Taiwan. What is your opinion, General, of what we will do if Xi lurches at Taiwan?
Well, I think our message to Xi has to be, hey, listen, every time that China has threatened Taiwan, we have responded. So they have no reason to believe that we won't. But I think the strategy of strategic ambiguity is something to keep in place because, of course, in our democracy, it's the American people who decide, if you go to war or not. And the most urgent action, Hugh, is to help Taiwan defend itself. Taiwan was complacent for the first 15 years of this century. They're playing catch up. I think the period of maximum danger is after the Chinese Communist Party Congress in November and before 2025, when a lot of the new defense capabilities that Taiwan has purchased and is integrating, as well as what the Japanese self-defense forces are integrating, come online. And I think what Xi Jinping, because he's under pressure domestically as well, may see this as a fleeting window of opportunity between the end of this year and 2025. So we ought to be in a race to help Taiwan strengthen its defense capabilities. And of course, our forward position forces there are immensely important for deterrence as well. And this is tied to the South China Sea. I mean, look south of Taiwan. I mean, that's the land grab that he's trying to affect right there. And I think it's helpful sometimes to turn the map 90 degrees to the left and look at where Taiwan sits and how control of Taiwan will also isolate and threaten Japan.
Of course. So, General, I want to close on a dereliction of duty note. The erosion of credibility in the McNamara-Johnson approach to the war was gradual. The erosion of credibility of the Biden administration has been rather rapid, and it came at great cost in Afghanistan, and it's now continuing in Ukraine. And I think it also crippled Dr. Fauci and our National Institute of Health director, Dr. Collins. When you lose credibility, how do you get it back? I mean, we have 3 years left of President Biden. We cannot afford an uncredible, broken executive branch. I mean, I don't know what to do about it. I want him to lose the next election, but we really cannot afford 3 years of infirmity perceived abroad by our enemies, can we?
Well, Hugh, I think what we've got to do is demand better from our leaders, and maybe the polling numbers will inspire a reassessment. But this story well. I mean, when I think about how bad things are today, I go back to the 1970s, and I think it looked pretty damn bad, right? We had a president resign under scandal. We had the humiliating withdrawal from Vietnam. We had stagflation. We had multiple energy crises. We had a hostage crisis, and then we had a change in leadership, right? And the Reagan administration wasn't perfect, but Reagan was a leader who got to the politics of addition. He reached out to Americans who otherwise would not have supported him, and he brought Americans together and reinforced, I think, our confidence in who we are as Americans and strengthened the fabric of our society. And we came out of it. We came out of the 70s and gained strength in the 1980s. And ultimately, we competed effectively internationally as a result of that. I remember when Reagan was asked, what's your vision for the end of the
we win.
So we win, they lose. And so I think if you go back to the speech he gave in the British Parliament, the speech he gave at the Berlin Wall, I think we need a leader who can sort of project that confidence and bring Americans together. We're getting to the politics of subtraction, Hugh, is in my view. I'm not an expert on this by any means, right? I mean, I'm a washed-up general, but I think you have both political parties kind of move into these kind of smaller tents, and a lot of Americans are left in the middle saying, okay, hey, who's gonna lead us? Who's gonna bring this country together? So I think maybe if we demand that our leaders don't compromise our principles for partisan political gain, I think that's really what we ought to be about. And we need leadership. I mean, it sounds kind of like a trite answer, but I think that's what we need.
Well, that leads me to my last question. Article 5 of NATO. Estonia has got a bunch of Russians. They're being menaced. Lithuania is being punished by Putin. China is attempting to intimidate Australia. That's not Article 5. But do you believe in your heart, General McMaster, that the American people would defend the Baltics and Poland and Romania and Bulgaria, who are full-fledged members of NATO? And do you think Putin believes that we would, which is the more important question?
I think so. And I think the reason is that Americans, I think, have an understanding of history. And so we have to go back to, and this is overdone, the Munich analogy, but, I'll tell you that during the Olympics, you heard the analogy of the 1936 Olympics, right, with China. Yep. I do think that if you look at really what happened at Munich, and then what happened the next year, right? What we're seeing now is Putin trying to get what he wants in Ukraine. Is he going to be happy with that? He's not going to be happy with that. Of course, 1939 was the year that the Soviet Union and Germany divided up Poland, right? And what's striking about what we're seeing with all these false flag operations, Hugh, I mean, it's almost exactly what Nazi Germany
Yep.
was doing to portray Poland as the aggressor. So, I think what we Americans recognize, I hope what we recognize, is that threats to our security that develop abroad can only be dealt with at an exorbitant cost once they reach our shores. And I think what, of course, we want to do is, more than anything, is deter conflict. What Putin is saying is extremely irresponsible in terms of his threats of nuclear war. With
Yes.
this strategy of escalation domination, where he's basically threatening to use nuclear weapons in Europe, and then to sue for peace on his own terms with America by posing the threat of a nuclear Armageddon. I mean, who talks like that? Do you remember, even going back to 2018? Do you remember when he showed that animated video of Russian missiles descending on what looked like kind of Mar-a-Lago in Florida? I mean,
Yep.
so I mean, this guy's not going to get better, right? He has to be met with strength, or he's going to push to the very limits.
So more troops for Lithuania, more troops for Estonia, more Americans in Latvia, that sort of thing, and especially Poland, General.
Well, and invest more in our defense capabilities. Hugh, I mean, this administration, I think, is going to come out with a national defense strategy that focuses almost exclusively on China. Hey, well, this ought to be instructive, right? The U.S. has global interests, and we have to be able to defend more than against one threat. And so, Russia's defense budget is estimated at $62 billion. I mean, we're only spending 3.5% of our GDP on defense, which is a historic low, since the end of World War II. What if we just increased our defense budget by $62 billion right now? And said, okay, Russia, what do you think of that? And I think that we've gotten too light in our forces at times. I mean, Russia's massing armored forces, right? We go down this path of high tech a lot of times, and we talk about how forces need to be lean and nimble. But Hugh, Richard Simmons is lean and nimble, but you don't send him to kick anybody's ass. You know what I mean?
No.
So you need, right? So you need forward position capable forces. We don't have any tanks in Europe. Why? I mean, permanently stationed in Europe. I mean, why?
Yeah.
Because we just got on this path. We talked ourselves into, we just need to be more nifty. But you know what?
The end of history. We bought the end of history, General. And your book, Battleground and Derelict, there is no end of history. There is always a tyrant.
Absolutely. And peace through strength, right? Ronald Reagan had that right, and so did George Washington.
You're right, General. I want to recommend to everyone, Battlegrounds is a tutorial on everything. I didn't think it was going to be as relevant as it is. It's so like today's headlines, and dereliction of duty will never not be relevant because telling the truth to the American people, essential at all times. General, thank you for the extended conversation. I hope when you're down in Southern California, we can get together. In the meantime, audience, dereliction of duty, but especially Battlegrounds. If you want to be smart about what the Russians are doing, go get Battlegrounds today. Thank you, General.
Thanks, Hugh.